Imagine waking up one day and realizing that most of the decisions you've made, your career path, your beliefs, your habits, even the way you hold your own body, were not entirely yours. They were whispers of expectations, echoes of people long gone, habits inherited from a society you never consciously chose. You rise from bed and look in the mirror, but something feels off. The person staring back at you carries a name, a job title, a history, but not a clear sense of who they are. It's as if you've been living as a guest in your own life. You might think this is an exaggeration, but pause for a moment. How much of what you call yourself is simply the sum of external influences, parents, teachers, trends, algorithms, unspoken rules? How often do you act from a place of pure inner will rather than reaction or obligation? If you're honest, the line between what is yours and what is imposed blurs quickly. And yet, without realizing it, you've built your identity on top of this uncertain foundation. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Become who you are." But what does that actually mean? This isn't a motivational slogan to plaster on a wall. It's a demand, almost a threat. It's a call to arms against the quiet erosion of the self. But here's the paradox. How can you become who you are if you don't know who that is? How can you take command of a ship when you've been asleep at the helm for years, perhaps decades? Most people never ask this question. They think of mastery as controlling external circumstances, career success, influence over others, financial security, but rarely as mastering the hidden machinery of their own psyche. Even fewer dare to confront the uncomfortable truth Nietzsche hinted at, that true self-mastery begins with the terrifying work of dismantling illusions. It's not about adding more to yourself, but stripping away the borrowed layers until you're face to face with something raw, unfiltered, and possibly unsettling. Imagine the discomfort of that moment. You stand before a blank canvas, realizing the portrait of your life was painted by many hands. The colors you've worn with pride may not even be your own. Would you still recognize yourself if you stripped those colors away? Would you feel freer or more lost? And yet there's something electrifying about the possibility. Beneath the social masks, beneath the inherited scripts, there's a current, a pulse of something uniquely yours. Nietzsche called it your will to power, not in the vulgar sense of domination, but as the deep creative force to shape your life according to your own inner law. Most people never touch this force directly. They settle for shadows of themselves, living in second-hand narratives, mistaking obedience for virtue and compromise for wisdom. But here lies the great question, the one you can't escape once you see it. If you are not the author of your own life, then who is? And if you are the author, then why does so much of your story feel like it's been written for you? This question is not polite. It won't sit quietly in the corner. It has teeth, and once it bites, it refuses to let go. It demands that you examine everything you've called truth about yourself, your fears, your desires, your ambitions. It asks you whether you've been living as a master of your inner world or as a servant of invisible masters. Nietzsche's forgotten lesson on self-mastery is not about exerting control in the way we've been taught to think about control. It's not about rigid discipline or moral perfectionism. It's about something far more dangerous and liberating, the courage to destroy false selves so the real one can emerge. And until you ask the questions no one taught you to ask, you will never find it. So here you are, standing on the edge of a cliff you didn't even know existed. Below you is the life you've been living. Ahead of you is a vast, uncharted expanse, the possibility of becoming someone new, someone truly yours. But to step forward, you'll have to risk everything familiar. Are you willing to do that? Or will you turn away and return to the safety of the known? As you sit with that question, the air around you seems to thicken. You can almost feel the weight of your own unrealized potential pressing against your ribs. This isn't a thought experiment anymore, it's a mirror. And in that mirror, you see not just what you are, but what you could become, if you dared. This is the doorway to Nietzsche's forgotten lesson. On the other side lies a deeper understanding of the hidden forces that shape you and how you can wrest back control. But before we can cross that threshold, we must first unearth the roots of the problem, why so many of us feel alienated from our own will, and how this alienation began. You sense it now, the quiet dissonance between the life you inhabit and the life you might actually want. But this dissonance isn't new. It began long before you could articulate it, long before you even had language for it. It began the moment you learned, without being told outright, that there are rules for existing, rules that seem to govern every choice you make. As a child, you didn't question them, you absorbed them. Good children do this, good children don't do that. Approval felt like survival, and so you bent yourself to fit. You mistook compliance for belonging, and the shaping began. By adulthood, the shaping is nearly invisible. You don't even notice the small betrayals of your own instincts, the way you silence a strange but intriguing thought, the way you laugh at jokes you don't find funny, the way you nod along when everyone else is nodding. These are not small things. They are the daily erosion of the self. The shadow grows as you push more of yourself underground, as you exile pieces of who you are in order to stay acceptable. Carl Jung warned of this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Think about that for a moment. How much of what you call fate is actually unexamined habit? How many of your choices are simply reflexes conditioned by reward and punishment loops you never chose? Jung called this buried part of us the shadow, not evil in itself, but the sum of what we've disowned. Every suppressed desire, every forbidden impulse, every unspoken truth becomes part of this subterranean self. You may not see it, but it shapes you like a hidden gravity. You project it onto others, despise it in them, and never notice it in yourself. This is how you lose mastery without realizing it. Nietzsche saw another dimension of the same problem. He looked at the modern individual and saw a creature tamed, domesticated by centuries of moral systems designed to restrain, not liberate. He called this the slave morality, a mode of living that values obedience, humility, and comfort over strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. It doesn't matter whether you're religious or secular, the conditioning is the same. You're taught to fear your own power, to distrust your instincts, to wait for permission. In Nietzsche's eyes, modern man is not so much living as he is being lived by the values of others. And yet, the culture we live in doubles down. Aldous Huxley warned of a future where people would love their servitude, where pleasure and distraction would keep them docile. Look around and you'll see it. Endless scrolling, curated identities, algorithmic validation. We've traded external authorities for digital ones, but the effect is the same. Instead of priests, we're peers. We have influencers. Instead of dogma, we have trends. Instead of confessionals, we have comment sections. The apparatus of conformity is slicker now, but no less effective. From a psychological perspective, this makes perfect sense. The brain craves predictability. It would rather run on autopilot than face the anxiety of freedom. Freedom requires conscious choice, and conscious choice is metabolically expensive. So you develop cognitive biases that protect you from discomfort. Confirmation bias to shield you from dissonance, the status quo bias to keep you from risking change, the herd instinct to ensure you're never too far from the safety of the group. These biases are not moral failings, they're survival mechanisms, but survival mechanisms are not the same as living. Here's the deeper problem. When you suppress your instincts, when you outsource your values, when you live by scripts written by others, you don't just lose spontaneity, you lose vitality. You feel it as a dullness, a low-grade dissatisfaction, a sense that life is happening somewhere else. You may call it burnout or depression or just the way things are, but beneath the label is the same core experience: alienation from your own will. Jean-Paul Sartre described this state as bad faith, a self-deception where you pretend your choices are inevitable so you don't have to face the terror of freedom. You tell yourself you have to stay in the job you hate, have to maintain the relationship that drains you, have to keep quiet about what you really think. In reality, you're choosing comfort over authenticity. Every day you do, the gap widens between who you are and who you might become. This is why Nietzsche's call to become who you are sounds so radical. It's not a call to self-indulgence, it's a call to self-confrontation. It asks you to stop lying to yourself, to stop living in bad faith, to stop mistaking external validation for selfhood. It demands you reclaim your instincts, your desires, your creative force, not to dominate others, but to shape your own life with intention. And because it's so demanding, most people ignore it. They prefer the numbness of a second-hand life to the anxiety of a self-created one. But ignoring it has a cost. When you bury your shadow, when you refuse to claim your own will, it doesn't disappear. It festers. It leaks out as resentment, envy, cynicism, or self-sabotage. It poisons relationships, saps energy, and leaves you feeling like a stranger in your own story. Nietzsche and Jung both warned, what you repress, you will eventually become a prisoner of. Look closely at your own life. Where are you saying, I have no choice, when in fact you're choosing? Where are you outsourcing your values to the crowd? Where have you buried your vitality under the mask of responsibility or realism? These are not abstract questions. They're the first steps in tracing the hidden architecture of your unfreedom. This is the hidden problem. A life built on borrowed instincts, running on unconscious scripts, maintained by psychological biases and cultural conditioning. It's not your fault that you were shaped this way, but it is your responsibility to see it, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, the possibility of mastery reappears, not mastery over others, but mastery over the self you've been estranged from. Yet recognizing the problem is only half the battle. The other half is facing the consequences of having lived under its spell. What has it already cost you? How does it distort not just your choices, but your perception of reality itself? What does it do to a society when millions live in bad faith, alienated from their own will? Those are the questions we must now confront. You've begun to glimpse the architecture of your unfreedom, but seeing the blueprint doesn't undo the building. For years, maybe decades, you've been living inside a structure of habits, beliefs, and invisible rules. What has that done to you? What has it done to all of us? First, it distorts your perception of reality itself. When you live by scripts written by others, you see the world through borrowed eyes. Everything becomes a reflection of someone else's values. You don't just think in cliches, you feel in cliches. Desire starts to look like advertising. Ambition starts to look like comparison. Even your suffering takes a rehearsed shape, the kind you've been taught to display for sympathy or social approval. Without noticing, you begin to mistake performance for authenticity. This distortion extends deep into the nervous system. Neuroscience shows that repeated patterns of thought and behavior carve grooves in the brain. The more you suppress an instinct, the weaker its neural pathway becomes. Meanwhile, the circuits for compliance and self-censorship grow stronger. Over time, you don't just act tamed, you become tamed. The leash moves inside you. You no longer need external punishment to stay in line. You punish yourself. This is what Nietzsche called the internalization of man, the moment when external authority becomes an inner voice of guilt, shame, and self-mistrust. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You want to take a creative risk, start a business, write a book, end a relationship. But the thought makes your stomach clench. Before you've even acted, your mind floods with reasons not to. It's not practical. People will think I'm foolish. What if I fail? These aren't just thoughts. They're the echoes of conditioning. They're the ghost of the crowd speaking through you, and you mistake that ghost for your own prudence. Multiply this by millions of individuals, and you get a society that looks free on the surface, but behaves like a single organism below it. People endlessly scroll, consume, compare, and conform, not because someone is forcing them, but because the pattern has been internalized. This is why Huxley feared pleasure more than pain. Pain at least awakens resistance. Pleasure lulls you into agreement. You become addicted to the very mechanisms that keep you docile. The consequences are subtle but devastating. Creativity dries up because true creativity requires risk. Relationships become transactional because true intimacy requires vulnerability. Work becomes a performance because true vocation requires calling. Even morality itself becomes hollow because you're not acting from inner conviction but from learned scripts. You may call it success, house, status, curated image, but inside you feel a strange hollowness, like an actor who never leaves the stage. Psychologists call this self-alienation. Nietzsche described it as ressentiment, a slow, burning resentment that builds when you deny your own instincts for too long. You start to envy those who seem free, mock those who take risks, and rationalize your own inertia as virtue. I'm the responsible one, you tell yourself. They're reckless. But beneath the rationalizations is a quiet grief, the life unlived, the self unclaimed. The consequences don't stop at the personal. They ripple outward into culture. A society of alienated individuals becomes easy to govern but hard to inspire. It produces compliance but not greatness. It celebrates relatable mediocrity while punishing originality. It rewards outrage more than courage because outrage is safe. It keeps people talking but not acting. This is how you end up with a culture obsessed with optics, metrics, and performance but starved of meaning. Look at the symptoms. Rising anxiety despite rising comfort, endless entertainment yet deep boredom, an explosion of self-help content but a collapse of real self-trust. These are not random trends. They're the natural outcome of a populace trained to outsource its instincts, values, and attention. As Viktor Frankl warned, when a person can no longer find meaning, they begin to chase pleasure or power as substitutes. Neither can satisfy for long. And there's a cruel paradox. The more alienated you become from your own will, the more you seek external control over your environment, over other people, over your own image. You micromanage your life down to the smallest detail while feeling less and less in charge of it. You follow productivity systems, diet plans, relationship rules, spiritual routines. Each new method promises mastery. Each one quietly deepens dependence. You're like a sailor adding ropes to the mast, convinced you're steering the ship while you're binding yourself tighter. This is the heart of the unseen consequence. You lose not only the ability to act freely, but the sense that freedom is even possible. You adjust to the cage until you call it home. You mistake numbness for peace, distraction for joy, survival for living. You stop asking the questions that once burned inside you. The cliff you stood on in the first section seems farther and farther away. But there's still a part of you, a faint pulse under the noise, that hasn't been extinguished. You feel it in moments of awe when a piece of music moves you or a sudden insight breaks through your routine. You feel it in moments of quiet rebellion when you say no without permission or create something for no reason other than it feels right. These are cracks in the cage. They're evidence that the will to power, the will to shape your life, isn't dead. It's waiting. Nietzsche believed that this buried force, once awakened, could transform not just an individual, but a culture. But awakening it requires a revolt against everything that has kept you docile. It's not a rebellion of slogans or protests, but a rebellion of the soul. The decision to stop living as a copy and begin living as an original. It's the courage to bear the anxiety of freedom rather than the comfort of bondage. That rebellion begins not with action, but with recognition. To see the unseen consequences is already to loosen their grip. Once you see the mechanisms, they can no longer operate purely in the dark. Awareness creates a gap, and in that gap lies possibility. The next step, the hardest and most liberating, is to act from that gap, to stop waiting for permission, to risk authenticity, to rebuild your life around your own instincts, even when they contradict the scripts you've inherited. This is where Nietzsche's forgotten lesson begins to take shape, not as an idea, but as a practice. In the next part, we'll cross that threshold. We'll explore what this rebellion looks like, not in slogans but in lived experience, and how you can begin to break free from the invisible machinery that has been shaping you all along. Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads. Behind you stretches the familiar path of compliance, comfortable, predictable, lined with the well-lit signposts of convention. Ahead of you lies a wild, unmarked trail winding into the unknown. No one can tell you where it leads. The terrain is rough, the weather unpredictable, yet something inside you stirs, a faint but unmistakable pull toward that untamed direction. This is the moment Nietzsche spoke of when he called for the revaluation of all values. This is the birth of self-mastery, the decision to rebel, not against society for its own sake, but against the parts of yourself that have been colonized by society. Most people imagine rebellion as noise, protests, slogans, dramatic gestures, but the rebellion Nietzsche envisioned is quieter, more radical. It begins inside you, in the small but seismic choice to stop lying to yourself. It starts when you take off the masks you've worn for so long that they feel like skin. It deepens when you ask, with brutal honesty, what do I actually value when no one is watching? What am I willing to lose rather than betray myself? This isn't self-improvement in the consumer sense. It's self-disruption. Carl Jung described individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, as a kind of inner alchemy. To individuate is to reclaim the shadow, to reintegrate what you've exiled. Every time you admit a forbidden impulse, acknowledge a hidden desire, or confront a fear you've avoided, you melt down a piece of the old self and forge it into something whole. This is not pleasant work. It feels like disloyalty to the person you've been, but without it, you remain fragmented, ruled by forces you refuse to name. Nietzsche framed a similar process with his image of the three metamorphoses: the camel, the lion, and the child. First, the camel, bearing the burdens of tradition, duty, and thou shalt. Then the lion, roaring no to imposed values, breaking chains, clearing space. Finally, the child, saying yes again, but this time from a place of freedom, creating new values out of play and possibility. Most people never move beyond the camel stage. They shoulder the loads of expectation until they collapse. Some reach the lion stage, rebellion, but mistake destruction for freedom. Very few become the child, a self-creating, self-directing being who can say yes to life on their own terms. How do you begin this transformation in practice? You start with radical self-observation, not judgment, observation. Notice when you're performing rather than living. Catch yourself saying, "I have to," when you mean, "I choose to." Track the moments when your body tenses at the thought of authenticity. These are signals from your shadow pointing to where you've given up your will. Next, reclaim small acts of agency. You don't have to upend your life overnight. Begin with micro-rebellions. Speak an unpopular truth in a meeting. Decline an invitation without inventing an excuse. Create something that serves no purpose but joy. Each act weakens the grip of conditioning. Each act strengthens the neural pathways of autonomy. Freedom, like a muscle, grows with use. At the same time, resist the temptation to replace one borrowed identity with another. The culture of personal branding will try to sell you a new mask, quirky, edgy, authentic, but still curated. This is conformity in disguise. Nietzsche warned against becoming a last man, someone who confuses comfort and novelty for transformation. Real transformation is deeper and slower. It's less about spectacle and more about stamina, the willingness to live without a script long enough for your own values to emerge. You will feel fear. Sartre called it the vertigo of freedom. When the scaffolding of imposed values falls away, you're left with a terrifying openness. No one will tell you what to do. No one will guarantee you're right. This is the price of self-mastery. But on the other side of that vertigo is exhilaration. The moment you act from your own center and feel for the first time that your life fits your skin. It helps to cultivate what Viktor Frankl called the space between stimulus and response. Instead of reacting automatically, pause, breathe, ask, whose voice is this? Whose value am I obeying? That pause is a crack in the machinery. Through it, a different kind of will can enter, the will that chooses rather than complies. You can also draw strength from exemplars, not as idols, but as reminders. Nietzsche himself, despite illness and obscurity, wrote with ferocious independence. Jung risked his reputation to explore the unconscious. Dostoevsky transformed his imprisonment into insight. Each refused to let external circumstances dictate their inner trajectory. Their lives were not easy, but they were theirs. As you practice these shifts, you'll notice subtle changes. Your no becomes clearer, your yes becomes lighter. The opinions of others still register but no longer decide. You begin to taste what Nietzsche meant by the will to power. Not domination, but creation, the capacity to shape a life congruent with your deepest instincts. This is not selfishness. In fact, it's the opposite. When you live from your own center, you stop trying to control others. You offer them the same freedom you claim for yourself. And perhaps the most radical act of all, forgive yourself for the years spent asleep. The point is not to shame the camel, but to honor the journey. Every burden you carried, every mask you wore, prepared you to recognize their weight. Self-mastery is not a clean break. It's a continuous unfolding, a spiral rather than a straight line. This rebellion will not make you invulnerable. It will not spare you suffering, but it will make your suffering yours. It will turn pain into information, fear into fuel, confusion into creation. That is the difference between being acted upon and acting. That is the difference between a life borrowed and a life built. And yet, even this is not the final stage. Rebellion clears the ground, but what do you build upon it? Once you've broken free from imposed values, how do you craft your own? How do you live not just as a lion, but as a child, innocent, playful, affirmative? That is the ultimate question Nietzsche leaves us with. The answer is not in theory, but in a lived realization we have yet to explore. You have burned away the illusions, peeled off the masks, rebelled against the invisible masters, and yet you stand now in an unfamiliar clearing surrounded by silence. For the first time in your life there is no script, no inherited map, no "thou shalt" or "thou shalt not" echoing from the past. Freedom feels like an open sky, immense, beautiful, and terrifying. What happens now? This is the point where many falter. They confuse liberation with emptiness. They think that without external authority there can be no meaning. But Nietzsche's forgotten lesson isn't merely about breaking chains. It's about what you do after the chains fall away. It's about the courage to create values, not just negate them. It's about learning to say an authentic yes after so many necessary no's. Imagine a child at play, building castles from mud, inventing worlds from nothing. There is no audience, no outcome to measure, no self-consciousness. The game is its own justification. Nietzsche used this image, the child, as the final metamorphosis of the spirit. After the camel, burden, and the lion, rebellion, comes the child, creation. Not a return to naivety, but a return to innocence after experience, a hard-won innocence, an earned spontaneity. This is self-mastery's highest form, not control, but creation. In this state, you don't live according to prefabricated rules, but according to an inner rhythm. You're no longer obsessed with comparison because your life is no longer a competition. It's a composition. Work becomes expression rather than performance. Relationships become encounters between whole beings rather than exchanges between masks. Suffering becomes part of the art rather than an interruption to it. You begin to feel a strange sense of gratitude, even for the hardships that once embittered you, because they have become raw material for the person you're shaping. Carl Jung would call this individuation complete, not in the sense of finished, but in the sense of integrated. The shadow no longer lurks in the basement. It's been acknowledged, owned, woven into consciousness. You're no longer at war with your instincts, but in dialogue with them. Your life ceases to feel like a split between who you are and what you're supposed to be. There is unity, and from unity flows energy.